Welcome to Barron's PASSKEY to the TOEFL iBT, 6th edition, copyright 2006 by Barron's Educational Series, Incorporated. Do you know what a passkey is? A passkey is a master key, a key that opens every door. This book and the audio CDs were designed to help you prepare for the iBT, the internet-based TOEFL. After you have succeeded on the TOEFL, other doors will open for you, but first you need a passkey to unlock the TOEFL. On the audio CDs, you will hear the script for Model Test 2 and Model Test 3 in the book. Congratulations for choosing the leader in test preparation. More than 1 million students have used Barron's books, audio CDs, and CD-ROMs to succeed on the TOEFL. You can be successful too. Here is the key. Let's begin.
Model Test 2, Listening Section.
The listening section tests your ability to understand spoken English that is typical of interactions and academic speech on college campuses. During the test, you will respond to conversations and lectures. This is the short format for the listening section. On the short format, you will respond to 2 conversations and 4 lectures. After each listening passage, you will answer 5 to 6 questions about it. You will hear each conversation or lecture 1 time. You may take notes while you listen, but notes are not graded. You may use your notes to answer the questions. Choose the best answer for multiple choice questions. Follow the directions on the page or on the screen for computer-assisted questions. Click on Next and OK to go to the next question. You cannot return to previous questions. You have 25 to 30 minutes to answer all of the questions. A clock on the screen will show you how much time you have to complete your answers for the section. The clock does not count the time you are listening to the conversations and lectures.
Listening 1, Professor's Office.
Listen to part of a conversation between a student and a professor.
Professor James, do you have a minute?
Sure. Come on in. What can I do for you?
Well, I did pretty well on the midterm.
You sure did. One of the best grades, as I recall.
But I missed a question, and I'd appreciate it if you could help me understand what I did wrong. I have the test right here, and I just can't figure it out.
Okay, fire away.
It's question 7, the one on biotic provinces and biomes.
Oh, that one. Quite a few people missed it. I was thinking that we should go over it again in class. But anyway, let's look at your answer.
Thanks. Here's the thing. I said that a biotic province was a region with similar life, but with boundaries that prevent plants and animals from spreading to other regions. So an animal, for example, a mammal, it may have a genetic ancestor in common with another mammal. But a biome's a similar environment, an ecosystem really, like a desert or a tropical rainforest. So in the case of a biome, well, the similar climate causes the plants and animals to evolve, to adapt to the climate, and that's why they look alike.
That's good. Very good, as far as you went. But there's a second part to the question. Look, right here. Include an explanation of convergent and divergent evolution. So I was looking for a more complete answer. Next time, be sure to include both parts of a question, when there are 2 parts, like this one. Do you know how to explain convergent and divergent evolution?
I think so. Isn't it like when a group of plants or animals, when they're separated by mountains or a large body of water, then subpopulations evolve from a common ancestor and they have similar characteristics, but their development diverges because of the separation. So that's why we call it divergent evolution.
Right. Even when the habitat's similar, if they're separated, then they diverge. How about convergent evolution then?
Well, that would be a situation where a similar environment, a habitat, it may cause plants and animals to evolve in order to adapt to the conditions. So a species that isn't really related can evolve with similar characteristics because it can look like a species in another geographic region because of adaptation. And that would be convergent evolution?
Right again. So temperature and rainfall, proximity to water, latitude and longitude all combine to determine the climate. And if we know the climate of an area, then we can actually predict what kind of life will inhabit it.
Okay. And I really did know that. I just didn't put it down. To tell the truth, I didn't see the second part, not until you pointed it out to me.
That's what I thought. Well, Jerry, it's a good idea to double-check all the questions on a test, not just my test, any test, to make sure you've answered each part of the question completely. Otherwise, you won't get full credit.
I see that. Well, live and learn.
Jerry, you're one of my best students.
Thanks. I really like biology. In fact, I'm thinking of majoring in it.
Good. That means you'll be in some of my upper-level classes.
And I'll be watching out for those two-part questions on your exams.
And all the rest of your exams. I'll be honest with you, my questions usually have two parts, so the students will have an insight into the grading system, and a lot of professors do that. In an essay question, it's difficult to know what to include and how much to write. Just read the question carefully and be sure to include all the parts. There may be 3 or 4 in some essay questions. This is the way that the professor helps you organize your answer. I'm giving my students a hint about what I'm looking for by including several parts to the question, but if you miss one of the parts, then it lowers your score.
That makes sense. I think I was just trying to finish within the time limit and I didn't read as carefully as I should have. On the final, I'll spend more time reading the questions before I start to answer them.
Good plan.
1. Why does the man go to see his professor? Two. Listen again to part of the conversation, and then answer the following question.
Thanks. Here's the thing. I said that a biotic province was a region with similar life, but with boundaries that prevent plants and animals from spreading to other regions.
Why does the man say this?
Thanks. Here's the thing.
Three. What did the man do wrong? Four. According to the student, what is divergent evolution? Five. What will Jerry probably do on the next test?
Listening 2. Art History Class.
Listen to part of a discussion in an art history class.
Sorry about the tests. I don't have them finished. They just took longer to grade than I thought they would. So I'll have them for you next time. Okay then, let's begin our discussion of the ballet. If you read the chapter in your text, you already know that in 1489, a performance that was something like a dinner theater was organized to celebrate the marriage of the Duke of Milan, and a dance representing Jason and the Argonauts was performed just before the roasted lamb was served. By the way, it's interesting that the dance was called an entree, and that name has been retained for courses and meals. Anyway, about the same time, outdoor entertainment, parades and equestrian events, they were becoming more popular, and we have evidence that they were referred to as horse ballets.
So the horse ballet, was it the first time the term ballet was used?
Right. The actual term in Italian was balletti, which meant a dance done in figures, and it was characterized by the arrangement of the performers in various patterns. Actually, the balletti were staged versions of the social dances that were popular at court, and the steps, the basic movements, they were walking, swaying, and turning. So they combined in a variety of sequences, each of which was named so that they could be referred to in the directions for individual dances. In fact, specific instructions for the placement of the dancer's feet probably provided the first record of the 5 positions of classical ballet. Question?
Sorry, I'm trying to get clear on the dancers. Could you explain what the book means about court dancing? And, I'm not saying this very well.
I think I know where you're going. You see, the directions that were written down were intended as a reference for social dancing, but they were important in the history of ballet because the theatrical dances or entertainments that preceded ballet were not performed by professional dancers. Members of the court danced for the entertainment of society, and in general, the performances were in the central halls of castles and palaces, with the audience seated in galleries above, so that the floor figures could be seen when the people looked down. But back to your question. Because of the limitations of the performers and the arrangement of the staging, well, the best way to impress the audience was to keep the steps simple enough for the amateur dancers, but the geometrical patterns had to be intricate and fresh, so the spectators would go away pleased because they'd seen something new.
Oh, I get it now. That makes sense, too, because everyone would be looking down at the dancers.
Exactly. Now, to continue that thought for a moment, by the middle of the 16th century, variety shows were being presented on a grand scale in northern Italy. They included both indoor and outdoor entertainment, and most people called them spettacoli. And France had begun to make a significant contribution to the dance form that evolved into modern ballet. But to be precise, it was Catherine de' Medici who used dance as part of her court entertainments and is credited with the use of the term ballet. In 1573, I think it was 1573, anyway, she organized a huge celebration to welcome the ambassadors from Poland who had arrived to offer their country's throne to her son Henri. So she called it the Polish Ballet, and the production was staged on a landing at the top of a grand staircase. 16 ladies, and these would not have been dancers, just members of court, so they represented the 16 provinces of France, and they performed a choreographed dance with a variety of floor figures. Afterward, the audience joined in court dances, similar to the ballroom dancing that evolved later. So that's a long answer to your original question.
Now, I have a question.
Okay.
You said that the Polish ballet was the first ballet, but I thought the book said the first ballet was Queen Louise's ballet.
Good question. Well, I said the Polish ballet was the first use of the term ballet for a dance performance, but Queen Louise's ballet is generally considered the first modern ballet. As you'll remember from the book, the ballet was performed before 10,000 guests, and it was 5 hours long. When I was doing the research for this lecture, I saw several references to the time, so I know that this is accurate. But I kept thinking, no one would watch a ballet for 5 hours. But it must be correct. I can only assume that other activities were going on simultaneously, like a banquet and conversation, don't you think? Anyway, what makes Queen Louise's ballet so unique, besides the length, and why it's the first modern ballet, is that it was connected by a storyline, or in technical terms, it's called dramatic cohesion. Each scene was related to the tales of Circe, a Greek enchantress, who used her powers to battle with man and the gods. The triumph of good, portrayed by Jupiter over evil, portrayed by Circe, was told in a, let's call it a unified production.
6. What is the discussion mainly about? Seven. Listen again to part of the lecture, and then answer the following question.
So I'll have them for you next time. Okay then, let's begin our discussion of the ballet.
Why does the professor say this?
Okay then.
Eight. According to the professor, what does the term balletti mean? 9. How did the early choreographers accommodate the abilities of amateur performers? 10. Why does the professor mention that he checked several references about the length of Queen Louise's ballet? 11. What can be inferred about the professor?
3. Linguistics class.
Listen to part of a discussion in a linguistics class.
What comes to mind when I say the word grammar?
That's easy. English class and lots of rules.
Memorizing parts of speech, like nouns and verbs.
Diagramming sentences.
Well, yes, that's fairly typical, but today we're going to look at grammar from the point of view of the linguist. And to do that, we really have to consider 3 distinct grammars for every language. The first grammar is referred to as a mental grammar, and that's what a speaker of a language knows often implicitly about the grammar of that language. This has also been called linguistic competence, and from that term, competence grammar has become popular. I like to think of mental or competence grammar. I like to think of it as an incredibly complex system that allows a speaker to produce language that other speakers can understand. It includes the sounds, the vocabulary, the order of words and sentences, and even the appropriateness of a topic or a word in a particular social situation. And what's so amazing is that most of us carry this knowledge around in our heads and use it without much reflection. One way to clarify mental or competence grammar is to ask a friend a question about a sentence. Your friend probably won't know why it's correct, but that friend will know if it's correct. So, one of the features of mental or competence grammar is this incredible sense of correctness and the ability to hear something that sounds odd in a language. Haven't you had the experience of hearing a sentence and it stood out to you? It just wasn't quite right. For native speakers, we can call this ability native intuition. But even language learners who've achieved a high level of competence in a second language will be able to give similar intuitive responses even if they can't explain the rules. So, that's mental grammar or competence grammar. Okay then, that brings us to the second type of grammar, and this is what linguists are most concerned about. This is descriptive grammar, which is a description of what the speakers know intuitively about a language. Linguists try to discover the underlying rules of mental or competence grammar and describe them objectively. So descriptive grammar is a model of competence grammar, and as such, it has to be based on the best effort of a linguist, and consequently subject to criticism and even disagreement from other linguists. Because no matter how skilled a linguist is, describing grammar is an enormous task. In the first place, the knowledge is incredibly vast and complex. In the second place, the language itself is changing even while it's being described. And finally, the same data can be organized in different but equally correct ways in order to arrive at generalizations. And the ultimate goal of a descriptive grammar is to formulate generalizations about a language that accurately reflect the mental rules that speakers have in their heads. But getting back to what most people think of as grammar, the grammar that we may have learned in school, that's very different from either competence grammar or descriptive grammar because the rules aren't meant to describe language at all. They're meant to prescribe and judge language as good or bad. And this kind of grammar is called, not surprisingly, prescriptive grammar because of its judgmental perspective. Again, to contrast prescriptive grammar with descriptive grammar, just think of descriptive generalizations as accepting the language that a speaker uses in an effort to describe it and recognizing that there may be several dialects that are used by various groups of speakers and that any one speaker will probably choose to use different language depending on the formality, for example, of the situation. On the other hand, prescriptive rules are rigid and subject to enforcement. Prescriptivists want to make all speakers conform to one standard in all situations. and that tends to be a very formal level of language all the time. Now, which of these types of grammar do you think you were learning in school when you had to memorize parts of speech and rules and diagram sentences?
Sounds like prescriptive grammar to me.
Precisely. But how did prescriptive rules get to be accepted, at least in the schools? And probably even more important, why are so many of these rules disregarded even by well-educated speakers in normal situations?
Did you say disregarded?
I did. Some of you may recall that during the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe, Latin was considered the perfect language and was used by the educated classes. The argument for the perfection of Latin was reinforced by the fact that Latin had become a written language, and consequently, Latin had stopped changing in the normal ways that spoken languages do. So the rules were also fixed, and for many writers of English during that period, the rules of Latin were held as a standard for all languages, including English. But the problem was that English had a different origin and very different constructions. For example, how many times have you heard the prescriptive rule, never end a sentence with a preposition? This is a Latin rule, but it doesn't apply to English. So it sounds very formal and even strange when this Latin rule is enforced. Now, how many of you would say, what are we waiting for? I think most of us would prefer it to, for what are we waiting? But as you see, this breaks the rule, the Latin rule, that is.
So we're really learning Latin rules in English classes. No wonder I was confused. But wouldn't you think that, well, that things would change? I mean, Latin hasn't been recognized as a world language for a long time.
You're right, but the reason that prescriptive rules survive is the school system. Teachers promote the prescriptive grammar as the standard for the school and, consequently, for the educated class. And good language is a requisite for social mobility, even when it's very dissimilar to the mental grammar or the descriptive grammar of a language.
12. What is the discussion mainly about? (13) How does the professor make his point about native intuition? (14) What are two key problems for descriptive grammar? (15) Listen again to part of the lecture and then answer the following question.
But how did prescriptive rules get to be accepted, at least in the schools? And probably even more important, why are so many of these rules disregarded even by well-educated speakers in normal situations?
Did you say disregarded?
Why does the student say this?
Did you say disregarded?
(16) According to the professor, why were Latin rules used for English grammar? (17) Why does the professor discuss the rule to avoid ending a sentence with a preposition?
Listening 4. College campus.
Listen to part of a conversation on campus between two students.
I didn't see you at the International Talent Show.
No time for that kind of thing.
You mean you don't belong to the ISA?
The ISA?
International Student Association.
Oh, no. I don't belong to any clubs.
But this isn't like a regular club.
How so?
Well, we have a house. You know, the brick house on Fraternity Row.
You live there, right?
Yeah. I moved in last year. It's really inexpensive because we take care of the house ourselves and we cook our own meals.
That sounds like it would take a lot of time.
Not really. There's a list of chores posted every week, and you can choose something you like to do. So I usually put my name down for yard work. I like being outside, so it's fun for me.
But you have to cook too, right?
Okay, it's like this. 20 of us live there, so every night 2 of the guys cook and 2 of the guys clean up. So you only have to cook about once a week and clean up once.
What about breakfast and lunch?
Oh, well, you're on your own for that. But the dinners are just fantastic. It's like eating in a different ethnic restaurant every night. You know, because the guys are from different countries.
Well, that sounds good.
And it costs about half what it did to live in the dorm. But really, I'm doing it because it's a great experience living with people from so many different countries. My best friend in the house is from Korea. My roommate's from Brazil. And I've got friends from, well, just about everywhere.
But you don't have to live in the house to belong to the club.
No. There are about 100 members in the International Student Association. Only guys live in the house. But there are a lot of women in the association.
I wish I had time to do it. It really sounds interesting.
You've got to relax sometimes. Anyway, we meet at the house the first Friday of the month from 7 to 10. We have a buffet dinner, and after that, we have a short meeting. That's when we plan our activities, like the talent show and picnics and dances. Then a lot of the people stay for music and a party, but some people leave after the meeting.
So it's only a couple hours a month?
Right. Listen, why don't you come over next Friday for the meeting as my guest? I mean, you have to eat anyway. And if you have a good time, you can think about joining.
Next Friday? Well, I don't know. I usually study on Friday night, but I could take a break. Sure, I'll come over, but I might have to leave early.
Great.
18. What is the purpose of this conversation? (19) What does the man imply about the house where he is living? (20) How does the man feel about the International Student Association? (21) Listen again to part of the conversation, and then answer the following question.
Then a lot of the people stay for music and a party, but some people leave after the meeting.
So it's only a couple hours a month?
What does the woman mean when she says this?
So it's only a couple hours a month?
(22) What does the woman agree to do?
Listening 5. Zoology class.
Listen to part of a lecture in a zoology class. The professor is discussing coral reefs.
Every ecosystem on Earth is unique, but the coral reef is perhaps the most unusual of all because it's the only ecosystem made by and made of animals. All coral reefs are constructed by coral polyps, which are generally small, about the size of this pencil eraser. But the structures themselves are, well, enormous. Astronauts have been able to identify the Great Barrier Reef in Australia from space. Can you believe that? And the diversity of species in large coral reefs is second only to the rainforest habitats. In fact, we estimate that for every species we've identified on a coral reef, there are probably 100 times that number that remain to be classified and studied. But how do these little polyps build such impressive reefs? Well, hard corals secrete a shell of calcium carbonate around their bodies. The polyp isn't hard, you see, but the shell is. And these shells are the material that forms a coral reef. So a coral reef is just a colony, millions and millions of coral animals whose shells are connected. And reproduction is really the basis for the construction of a large reef. You see, as each polyp matures, it converts the calcium and other minerals in ocean water to a hard limestone exoskeleton called a corallite. And this is fascinating. Although the polyps themselves don't appreciably increase in size, they continue to build new shells periodically, connecting them with partitions. Now, coral can reproduce sexually through an activity called mass spawning. During one night in the spring when the moon's full, coral polyps release egg bundles that contain both eggs and sperm. Most polyps have both male and female reproductive cells. The egg bundles are round, about half the size of marbles, I'd say. They're brightly colored in orange or red or pink, and they float up to the surface to form a thick layer of, think of them as rather fragrant beads. So, with the water so saturated with them, predators will only be able to devour a small number compared with the huge number that will survive and break open. The sperm cells swim away to fertilize the eggs from another bundle. So, once fertilized, the little egg begins to mature from a coral larva to a planulae, which can swim for a few hours, days, or even a few weeks. Ultimately, it locates a hard surface on which to attach itself and from which it will not move for the rest of its life, except for the movement involved in the process of building a new, neighboring shell as it continues to mature. But actually, sexual reproduction isn't the way that coral reefs are really constructed. When a polyp matures on the site it's selected, the habitat is identified as being conducive to reef building. So the mature polyp doesn't just grow bigger, it actually replicates itself in a process called budding. After the genetic material is duplicated, then the polyp divides itself in half, and each half becomes a completely mature polyp. This budding process repeats itself, eventually producing thousands of asexually budded coral polyps connected by a tissue that grows over the limestone shells between the polyps. So, as you can imagine, budding will produce a large number of individual polyps, but they'll all have exactly the same genetic code as the first polyp. And this creates the beginning of a coral reef, but without the diversity that eventually populates the habitat. Wherever a coral reef's constructed, abundant sea life congregates. In fact, it's been estimated that about 25% of all ocean species can be found within the coral reefs. Now, most coral polyps eat plankton, single-celled microscopic organisms that float or swim very slowly in the ocean water in their habitat. But a coral reef has such a high concentration of polyps, they can't rely solely on plankton to survive. So coral polyps have developed a symbiotic relationship with a single-celled algae called zooxanthellae. Remember that to qualify as symbiotic, a relationship must be mutually beneficial. So the zooxanthellae produces food for the coral through the byproducts of photosynthesis, and the coral provides a safe home for the zooxanthellae because it's hidden from predators that inhabit the coral reef. Every species of coral grows at a different rate, some as much as 6 inches a year. But faster-growing colonies are more prone to breaking apart, either from their own weight or from the continuous force of the ocean waves. Some species tend to grow more slowly, but they may live as long as 1,000 years. Even so, only the top portion of any reef is actually alive and growing, and the lower structure is comprised of the skeletal remains. That's limestone corallite from coral that has died. And what I find incredibly interesting about coral reefs is that each is a unique structure. But of course, scientists need to classify, and so there's a classification system for coral reefs. A fringing reef grows around islands and the shorelines of continents and extends out from the shore. In order to flourish, fringing reefs must have clean water, lots of sunshine, and a moderately high concentration of salt. Some good examples of fringing reefs can be found around the Hawaiian Islands. Oh yes, these are the most common and also the most recently formed class of coral reefs. Here's a drawing of a fringing reef. I think this is actually one of the Hawaiian reefs. Now, barrier reefs, they're found further from shore and they're usually separated from the shoreline by a shallow body of water, maybe a lagoon. As in the case of the Great Barrier Reef off the shore of Australia, the body of water can be miles wide, so the reef's miles away from the shoreline. And there may actually be a collection of coral reefs fused together. This is a drawing of a reef in the Great Barrier Chain. As I recall, there are about 25 or maybe even more individual coral reefs connected to form the Great Barrier Reef. As a general rule, barrier reefs are larger and older than fringing reefs. But the oldest class of coral reef is the atoll, which is a ring-shaped reef with a lagoon in the middle and deep water surrounding the ring. These are scattered throughout the South Pacific, kind of like oasis settlements in the desert, and they abound with a diversity of sea life. This is one of the South Pacific atolls. So, as we reflect on everything we've said about coral, we know that it's a relatively simple organism with a body ending in a mouth and tentacles. It reproduces both sexually and asexually by budding, and it survives by forming a symbiotic relationship with zooxanthellae. But none of this is very extraordinary. What's unique about coral in the animal kingdom is its ability to construct a variety of reefs, creating habitats that are absolutely unlike any others on Earth.
23. According to the professor, how do coral reefs grow? (24) Why are so many egg bundles released during mass spawning? (25) According to the professor, what is budding? (26) What is the relationship between zooxanthellae and coral polyps? (27) Which of the following reefs is probably an atoll? (28) In the lecture, the professor explains coral reefs. Indicate whether each of the following is a true statement about coral reefs. Click in the correct box for each phrase.
Listening 6. Business class.
Listen to part of a discussion in a business class.
Industry analysts report that multinational food companies are trying to use the same types of strategies that automobile and electronics manufacturers have found to be successful in the global marketplace. The problem is that general rules for products that tend to be traditional for national or even regional tastes, these products are very difficult to identify, and sales aren't easy to project. But the companies that tend to do best are those that are the most responsive to local tastes. And they spend development dollars on taste testing in the local markets before they formulate the final product. Can anyone recall any examples from the case studies in the text? Sandy?
McDonald's Big Mac has more mustard in the special sauce in Paris than it does in New York.
Because?
Because taste tests verified that people in the United States liked sweeter condiments than people did in France. In fact, I think the sugar content for export foods in general usually has to be modified when American products are taste tested overseas.
Right you are. Probably the company that's adapted most to local tastes is Nestle. Can you believe that they produce more than 200 slightly different blends of Nescafé for export to different countries? Amazing, but true. But sometimes taste is less a problem of ingredients and more a matter of the way a food product looks or feels. One case study that comes to mind is the one about the soft cookies that just don't sell as well in England as crisp cookies. So you can see that taste extends way beyond just flavor. It's really a combination of flavor preferences and local expectations. Look, here's another example of accommodation that had more to do with the expectation for a process than the flavor of the product. In this case study, it was cake. Remember when Betty Crocker cake mixes were introduced in England, they weren't accepted because the English homemaker felt more comfortable with convenience foods that required more than water to prepare them. Go figure. But that was the problem uncovered by extensive market research. So when the mix was reformulated without an egg, and the preparation included adding an egg with the water before mixing it, well, Betty Crocker cake mixes became very popular in England. Any other examples come to mind? They don't have to be from the case studies in the book.
How about serving sizes?
Go on.
Well, soft drinks for one. Just compare the serving sizes in the United States and many foreign markets where soft drinks are sold. The cans in foreign markets are much smaller because consumers expect it. But in the United States, well, supersizing is probably a consideration when a foreign company is trying to crack the American market.
That's a great example. So the taste can be acceptable, but the packaging has to compare favorably with the competing brands and the public's expectations.
Yeah, but that makes products more expensive, doesn't it? I mean, because you can't standardize the product or the packaging, so that would make it more costly to produce, wouldn't it?
Right you are, Chris. In fact, you've really gone to the heart of the issue. A compromise has to occur between the requirement that products be adapted to please the taste and the expectations of local consumers and the pressure to standardize products for maximum cost effectiveness. Now, let's complicate that even further. Even the experts don't agree on the importance of how far to go in adapting products for local markets. A few years ago, Ted Levitt, he's the editor of the Harvard Business Review, Levitt predicted what he called a pluralization of consumption. What he means is that, at least in some areas, tastes are likely to converge, which makes sense when you think about the increased opportunities for travel and sampling of foods, as well as the continued global marketing efforts by multinational corporations. So, logically, it's smarter to simply identify the areas in which tastes are most likely to be the same and concentrate efforts on those food products. But there's also the issue of global marketing. How about the potential to create taste? I mean, selling the image that surrounds using a product. If consumers want to associate themselves with that image, won't they develop a taste for the product that does that for them? For example, there's some evidence that the popularity of products seen in movies and television spills into the foreign marketplace. This subtle brand association with the movie or the celebrities in it translates into high-dollar deals for certain brands to be visibly displayed in widely distributed films.
Oh, right. I was reading about that. It was in a couple of the case studies. The bottle, a can, or a package appears as part of the character's persona. And if it's a character that audiences choose to identify with, then the taste for the product may follow, or at least that's what the marketing experts are betting on.
And that includes foreign audiences. Anyone drink Starbucks coffee? Well, Starbucks began as a regional coffee in Seattle, Washington, and made the global leap in 2000, opening shops in China, a huge market, surely, but also a traditionally tea-drinking society. So what's the attraction? Starbucks is marketing to the cosmopolitan consumer, the young trendy set looking for a modern image as well as a different taste. Still, there have been some real surprises in the multinational dinner party. No one has really figured out why the Italians, Germans, and British love Kraft's Philadelphia cream cheese, and the Greeks simply don't buy it. And why did Perrier, a mineral water from France, why did Perrier take America by storm while other imported mineral waters didn't? In short, success in the food export industry is probably a combination of the real taste, the flavor of the product, with some adaptation for the local markets, the satisfaction of certain expectations for the preparation and packaging, and the taste for the product created by images in the global marketing plan. Add to this mix the potential for a short shelf life or even perishable products, and, well, You have a very challenging problem for the multinational food industry.
29. What is the discussion mainly about? "30. How does the professor organize the lecture? 31. Listen again to part of the lecture, and then answer the following question.
Any other examples come to mind? They don't have to be from the case studies in the book.
How about serving sizes?
Why does the student say this?
How about serving sizes?
"32. What technique does the professor use to encourage student discussion? 33. What did Ted Levitt mean by the pluralization of consumption? 34. What does the professor say about television and movie companies? 'Model Test 2. Speaking Section. The speaking section tests your ability to communicate in English in an academic setting. During the test, you will be presented with 6 speaking questions. The questions ask for a response to a single question, a conversation, a talk, or a lecture. You may take notes as you listen, but notes are not graded. You may use your notes to answer the questions. Some of the questions ask for a response to a reading passage and a talk or a lecture. The reading passages and the questions are written, but most of the directions will be spoken. Your speaking will be evaluated on both the fluency of the language and the accuracy of the content. You will have 15 to 20 seconds to prepare and 45 to 60 seconds to respond to each question. Typically, a good response will require all of the response time, but the answer will be complete by the end of the response time. The time for the speaking section is about 20 minutes. A clock on the screen will show you how much time you have to prepare your answer and how much time you have to record it.
Number 1. Listen for a question about a familiar topic. After you hear the question, you have 15 seconds to prepare and 45 seconds to record your answer.
Explain how birthdays are celebrated in your country. Use specific examples and details in your explanation.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Number 2. Listen for a question that asks your opinion about a familiar topic. After you hear the question, you have 15 seconds to prepare and 45 seconds to record your answer.
Some students would rather write a paper than take a test. Other students would rather take a test instead of writing a paper. Which option do you prefer and why? Use specific reasons and examples to support your opinion.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Number 3. Read a short passage and listen to a talk on the same topic. Then listen for a question about them. After you hear the question, you have 30 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to record your answer.
A student is discussing the university's health insurance policy with the foreign student advisor. Read the policy in the college schedule printed on page 309. You have 45 seconds to complete it. Please begin reading now. Now listen to the foreign student advisor. He is explaining the policy and expressing his opinion about it.
I think it's very important for you to know that this policy wasn't instituted in order to increase fees for international students. In fact, the university doesn't make a profit from the sale of health insurance. The problem is that health care costs in this country are so high that it could be financially disastrous for the family of an international student who needed more than just a simple visit to the doctor's office. A trip to the emergency room at the hospital could cost thousands of dollars without health insurance. Most families abroad just don't realize how costly it is. As for foreign health insurance providers, well, it was just too difficult to validate their coverage for medical services, and the local doctors and hospitals simply stopped accepting them. So, to be sure that our students are protected, we're offering low-cost health insurance through the school.
The foreign student advisor expresses his opinion of the policy for health insurance. Report his opinion and explain the reasons that he gives for having that opinion.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Number 4. Read a short passage and listen to a lecture on the same topic. Then listen for a question about them. After you hear the question, you have 30 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to record your answer.
Now read the passage about Antarctica, printed on page 310. You have 45 seconds to complete it. Please begin reading now. Now listen to part of a lecture in a geography class. The professor is talking about Antarctica.
With the increasing pressure to replace raw materials that are being consumed in other parts of the world, Antarctica and the waters offshore could become a stage for international conflict in the future. During the 18th and 19th centuries, hunters decimated huge populations of whales and seals, and the race to reach the South Pole resulted in national claims by explorers from a variety of countries, which finally resulted in the partitioning of pie-shaped sectors radiating away from the center at the pole. So, today, several claims overlap, and only one sector remains unclaimed. Virtually all of these claims are covered by an ice sheet about 2 miles thick. But the question is, what's beneath the ice? Scientific experiments indicate that proteins, fuels, and minerals exist in abundance, and that means that in spite of the difficulties and challenges involved in the exploitation of these natural resources, the countries with claims haven't demonstrated an intention to relinquish their stake in the area. While resources are available in more convenient sites, the remote areas in Antarctica appear to be relatively safe from exploitation. In addition, as the reading passage suggests, global self-interest may engender international cooperation in this crucial environmental system.
Explain why many countries have staked claims in Antarctica, and why national interests have not been pursued.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Number 5. Listen to a short conversation. Then listen for a question about it. After you hear the question, you have 20 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to record your answer.
Now listen to a conversation between a student and her friend.
I need to earn some extra money. My budget's just out of control.
I hear you. I had the same problem last semester.
So what'd you do?
I got a job at the cafeteria. I don't really like the work, but the good thing is that you get free meals.
Really? Are they hiring?
I don't know, but I could ask. The pay isn't great, though. See, the meals are the thing.
Oh, still, that would cut down on the grocery bill.
Yeah. Or you know what? You could rent that extra room in your apartment. I'll bet you could get $250 a month, at least.
I've been thinking about that. It would help with the rent and the utilities, and I wouldn't have to work so I could use my time for my classes. But I keep thinking, what if my roommate doesn't pay on time, or what if there's a lot of noise?
Well, you'd have to have a deposit and a contract. Something in writing so you could keep the deposit if there were problems, and you could break the contract if it didn't work out.
Describe the woman's problem and the two suggestions that her friend makes about how to handle it. What do you think the woman should do, and why?
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Number 6. Listen to part of a lecture. Then listen for a question about it. After you hear the question, you have 20 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to record your answer.
Now listen to part of a lecture in a sociology class. The professor is discussing the criteria for using older research references.
Well, first of all, you have to understand that there's no hard and fast rule for deciding when a research reference is too old. But that doesn't help you much. So I'll try to give you a couple of guidelines, and then you'll just have to use good judgment. Okay, let's just say for our purposes that the research is 30 years old. Then the next thing to think about is whether any changes have occurred in society to call the data into question. For example, in a study that looks at diet, we know logically that many changes have occurred in eating patterns over the past 30 years, so this study would probably be out of date. But a study of, say, language development may be okay because the way that babies learn their native language hasn't changed much in the same period of time. So what I'm saying is, the date is less important than the potential for change. Okay, then the second criteria to consider is whether the citation is a finding or an opinion. If you have a study that indicates, for example, that college students are drinking more, that's a finding. But if you have a statement by the researcher that drinking is the most serious problem on campus, then you have an opinion. And opinions are accurate over the years as long as they're attributed to the person and the dates cited. But the finding for an older study may be too old. In that case, it's probably better to use a more recent study.
Using the main points and examples from the lecture, describe the two criteria for using an older research reference presented by the professor.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Model Test 2, Writing Section.
First, read the passage on page 315 and take notes. Now listen to a lecture on the same topic as the passage that you have just read.
Philosopher John Searle has challenged the validity of the Turing test because it's premised on behavior rather than on thought. To prove his argument, he suggested a paradox, which he refers to as the Chinese room. If a monolingual English-speaking person receives questions on a computer terminal from a Chinese person in another room, naturally, the English-speaking person won't understand the questions. However, if there's a large reference that can be accessed, and if the reference is detailed and comprehensible, then the English speaker could conceivably break the code. For example, if a sequence of Chinese characters are received, the reference could indicate which sequence of Chinese characters would be expected in response. In other words, the behavior would be correct, although the English speaker wouldn't be thinking at a level that included meaning. The person would be manipulating symbols without understanding them, or as Searle suggests, the person would be acting intelligent without being intelligent, which is exactly what a computer could be programmed to do. Therefore, at least theoretically, a computer could be designed with complex input that would allow it to provide adequate behavioral output without being aware of what it's doing. If so, then it could pass the Turing test. But the test itself would be meaningless because it doesn't really answer the most basic question about artificial intelligence, which is, can the computer think?
Model Test 2, Example Answers.
Example answer for independent speaking question 1, a birthday.
In my country, birthdays are celebrated every year, but the most important birthday for a young girl is the quinceañera, the birthday when she's 15. This is celebrated with a church service. The girl wears a white dress, kind of like a wedding dress, and several attendants accompany her to the altar where the priest talks with her about becoming an adult woman. After the service, the whole family celebrates with friends, and there's music and dancing and food. Traditionally, only relatives and close friends are invited to the church service, but many more people attend the party afterward. In the old days, the ceremony presented the girl to society for marriage proposals, but now she's considered the appropriate age to begin dating.
Example answer for independent speaking question 2, course requirements.
I prefer to write a paper instead of taking a test, because I know exactly what the topic is when I'm researching a paper, but there are a large number of possibilities for questions on a test, and that makes it much more difficult to prepare for. Besides, in my experience, some teachers aren't very straightforward about their tests, and even though I've studied and understand the subject, well, sometimes the questions that you'd expect to see aren't on the test, and some obscure information is tested instead. But probably the most important reason for my preference is that I get very nervous when I'm taking a test, and that can affect my performance. Writing a paper doesn't cause me the same level of anxiety.
Example answer for integrated speaking question 3, health insurance.
The foreign student advisor agrees with the policy that requires international students to purchase health insurance from the university at registration. He assures students that the university isn't trying to increase fees for international students by doing this. He explains that healthcare is very expensive. For example, a visit to the emergency room can be a financial burden to a family who doesn't have medical insurance. He says that most families of international students don't expect the cost to be so excessive. And the reason that the university doesn't allow students to substitute other healthcare providers is because the local medical community has had problems with validation for health insurance plans from abroad and now refuses to accept them. So, in order to protect the students, the school doesn't make any exceptions to the policy.
Example answer for integrated speaking question 4. Antarctica.
Many countries have staked claims in Antarctica because the natural resources in other areas are being depleted, and research indicates that minerals, fuels, and even some sources of protein are probably under the ice in large quantities. So, the implication is that as raw materials are exploited in areas that are relatively easy to reach, nations will think about taking advantage of their claims. For the time being, the location and climate have discouraged exploitation, and so have the treaties that protect the environment and encourage scientists to collaborate. It's also worth mentioning that Antarctica is vitally important to the balance that's maintained in the environment worldwide. So, in addition to all the difficulties that would have to be overcome to take advantage of the resources in their claims, individual nations also recognize the danger to the global environment and, at least for now, they're not pursuing their national interests.
Example answer for integrated speaking question 5. Extra money.
The woman needs additional income to meet her expenses, so her friend suggests that she get a job at the cafeteria. Even though the salary isn't very high, the free meals are helpful. He isn't sure whether there's a job available, but he agrees to find out. He also recommends that she rent the second bedroom in her apartment for a minimum of $250 a month, which would subsidize the rent and utilities. The problem she points out is that roommates can be disruptive and sometimes they aren't financially responsible. But she'd have more time to study if she didn't have to work, and her friend reminds her that she could require an agreement in writing, along with a deposit. Okay, in my opinion, she should try to get a job either in the cafeteria or someplace else on campus, because if she lives alone, she can maintain a quiet environment for study, and she won't have to worry about a contract that could be difficult to enforce.
Example answer for integrated speaking question 6. Research references.
According to the lecturer, there are 2 major criteria for using an older research reference. First, she mentions, and I'm quoting here, the potential for change. For example, research on diet may be too old after 30 years because many changes have occurred in dietary practices during that time. But research on language development may be okay because fewer changes have taken place in language acquisition in the same number of years. The other criteria requires that you first identify the research as a conclusion or an opinion because, in general, a conclusion may be outdated when a newer study is published, but an opinion credited to a person with the date of the opinion in the citation, that's correct over time. In other words, there's no exact number of years to decide whether a reference is acceptable, so the date isn't as significant as the criteria. So, an older study can be used if changes in the research haven't taken place, or if the results are worded as opinions with the date cited.
Model Test 3, Listening Section.
The listening section tests your ability to understand spoken English that is typical of interactions and academic speech on college campuses. During the test, you will respond to conversations and lectures. This is the short format for the listening section. On the short format, you will respond to 2 conversations and 4 lectures. After each listening passage, you will answer 5 to 6 questions about it. You will hear each conversation or lecture 1 time. You may take notes while you listen, but notes are not graded. You may use your notes to answer the questions. Choose the best answer for multiple choice questions. Follow the directions on the page or on the screen for computer-assisted questions. Click on Next and OK to go to the next question. You cannot return to previous questions. You have 25 to 30 minutes to answer all of the questions. A clock on the screen will show you how much time you have to complete your answers for the section. The clock does not count the time you are listening to the conversations and lectures.
Listening 1. Professor's Office.
Listen to a conversation between a student and a professor.
Hi, Dr. Davis. I'm a little early. Should I wait outside?
No, come on in. I'm free. What did you want to talk about?
Well, I've read the first couple of books you had on my list, the reading list for my independent study, and I was just wondering how you want me to report them to you. We didn't really talk about that.
Well, I'm glad you stopped by. Let me think. Didn't you have a project to do in addition to the reading list?
Yes. You said it could be a research paper, or I could come up with a proposal for a different kind of project.
That's right. So the reading list is background information then. Why don't you just come in when you finish the first part of the list? I think it was divided in 2 distinct parts. So just come in and we'll talk about the readings.
You mean I should prepare a synopsis of each book and kind of report to you on each one?
No. Nothing as formal as that. I was thinking more along the lines of a conversation. As I recall, the list has a focus, doesn't it?
Definitely. All of the books are novels and plays from the second half of the 20th century.
The postmodern period, then. And all North American novelists and playwrights.
Right.
So we should be able to find some common threads, then. Remember, though, postmodernism is very difficult to define precisely. Maybe we could start with a discussion of the themes that emerge in the collection of literature from that period.
That sounds interesting.
I think so, too. And by the time you get through with the second half of the reading list and we get together again, maybe we can figure out whether we're looking at a logical extension of postmodernism or whether there's actually a new movement there in the readings on the second part. If you'll notice, there are quite a few minority writers represented, so you might want to think about what that means.
I noticed that in the list. The first part of the list has the usual North American writers and, of course, a good representation of women writers, as you'd expect. But the second part of the list includes a number of African American authors, several Hispanic American writers, and a few Oriental Americans.
It's a multi-ethnic mix.
Yeah.
Good. So, have you decided whether you want to do a paper or something else, perhaps?
To tell the truth, I'd really like to do something a little more creative. Maybe bring in some visuals on the computer as part of the, I suppose you'd call it a mixed media report. But I've never done anything like that before.
But that's what an independent study is designed to do. It's an opportunity to experiment and to have some one-on-one time with a professor.
But a research paper is easier in some ways. At least I know that I can do a decent job. The computer project's unknown territory.
True, but remember it's unknown territory for all of us. I think I've heard some references to cybermodernism. If you want to investigate some of the work that's being created in, as you call it, mixed media literature.
Cybermodernism? Wow.
I think you'd find it interesting. Anyway, it's up to you. It's your project.
Thanks. I'm really excited about doing this independent study. Actually, I'm spending more time on it than on any of my other classes.
I've found that students usually invest more time and energy in a class that they can design. That's why I like to direct them. Oh, and Terry, if you run into any problems, don't wait until you're halfway through your reading list. Just stop by during my office hours. Maybe I can give you some references or at least a sounding board.
Thanks. This is better than I even expected.
1. Why does the man go to see his professor? Two. How is the second part of the reading list different from the first part? Three. Listen again to part of the conversation and then answer the following question.
I think I've heard some references to cybermodernism. If you want to investigate some of the work that's being created in, as you call it, mixed media literature.
Cybermodernism? Wow.
What does the man mean when he says this?
Cybermodernism? Wow.
Four. What will the man probably do before the next meeting? Five. What can be inferred about the professor?
Listening 2. Environmental Science Class.
Listen to part of a lecture in an environmental science class. The professor is talking about wind power.
Today I want to talk with you about another renewable source of energy, wind power. This isn't a new concept. In fact, wind's been used for centuries to pump water and launch sailing vessels. But more recently, wind power has been used to generate electricity. By the year 2000, California was using maybe 15,000 wind turbines to produce about 400 megawatts of electricity. And that was happening at a cost that would be considered competitive with coal or nuclear power. And although California currently leads the United States in harnessing wind power, there are several other areas that also hold considerable potential for increased production. Texas and the Dakotas alone have enough wind potential to power the nation. But since the winds there are so variable, well, wind power alone would be unreliable as a primary source of continuous energy. Nevertheless, it could be used as a secondary resource, along with fossil fuels. The strong and steady winds of the Pacific Northwest, especially in the Columbia River Basin, these winds would be ideal as a supplement to hydroelectric power when the river's experiencing periods of low water levels. Studies by the U.S. Department of Energy indicate that wind power generated from the Great Plains in the middle of the country could supply the continental United States with almost 75% of the electricity required for the region. In another section of the same report, it was noted that wind powers the world's fastest-growing energy source. Since 1998, the capacity for wind energies increased by more than 35% worldwide. And improvements in wind turbine technology in the past couple of decades has improved efficiency, cutting the cost dramatically from roughly 40 cents to about 4 cents per kilowatt hour. And in new turbine designs being tested with a lower torque so that may actually move the price closer to 3 cents. Europe currently accounts for over 70% of the world's wind power. India, China, Germany, Denmark, Italy, and Spain have published plans for major increases in wind-generated electricity projects in the next few years, and recent interest and exploration have been initiated in the United Kingdom and Brazil. Remote areas, especially islands, and other regions at a distance from electrical grids are vigorously exploring wind options. Clearly, the global implications, not only for cheap energy, but also for clean energy, could be enormous. And in some areas, the consumers are even willing to pay a subsidy for the pollution-free energy that wind provides their communities. In Colorado, for instance, through a program called WindSource, about 10,000 customers pay an additional $2.50 per month for every 100 kilowatt hours of wind power. Legislation in several states in the United States now requires utility companies to guarantee that a percentage of their electricity will be generated from renewable sources like wind power. Of course, there are some problems associated with wind power that do need to be considered. The blades on the turbines present a hazard to migrating birds. In some cases, the vibrations interfere with television reception in the area. And there's been objections to wind farms because they produce noise and because they're not visually appealing to residents nearby. So in addition to the studies to improve turbine design and energy efficiency, some of the attendant problems also require research and development. Regarding the noise, let me mention that design modifications, basically modifying the thickness of the turbine blades and making adjustments to the orientation of the turbines, these modifications have diminished the noise substantially in a number of sites. As for visual appeal, some creative ways to share the land to create a more attractive wind farm are being piloted. So that brings us to the issue of storing wind power. And although wind energy can be stored temporarily as battery power, the real challenge for wind power exploration will be how to level out the energy source. Alternatives for storage will be critical because even in an area with steady winds, wind's still not totally reliable. But the TELUS Institute has released promising results from studies to investigate the problem of intermittent wind. This is what they did. By dividing the wind turbines from one farm into two smaller farms with geographical separation, the capacity of the pair of farms increased by 33.33% over the efficiency of the larger farm with the same number of turbines. So, by taking advantage of the slightly different wind patterns, a more continuous supply of wind power can be generated. So, where are we with all of this? Well, the research that'll make wind power a viable option is underway, but we need to continue to study in order to solve some of the problems before we can use wind power as a primary source of energy globally.
6. What aspect of wind power is the lecture mainly about? Seven. Which two regions of the United States have the greatest potential for supplying wind power? Eight. Listen again to part of the lecture and then answer the following question.
Europe currently accounts for over 70% of the world's wind power. India, China, Germany, Denmark, Italy, and Spain have published plans for major increases in wind-generated electricity projects in the next few years, and recent interest and exploration have been initiated in the United Kingdom and Brazil.
Why does the professor say this?
Europe currently accounts for over 70% of the world's wind power.
Nine. In the lecture, the professor identifies several problems associated with wind power. Indicate whether each of the following is one of the problems mentioned. Click in the correct box for each phrase. Ten. How did the TELUS Institute solve the problem of intermittent wind? 11. What is the professor's opinion about the future of wind power?
Listening 3. Philosophy class.
Listen to part of a discussion in a philosophy class.
The earliest Greek philosophers, also known as the pre-Socratic philosophers, they were very interested in determining the nature of the universe. Initially, Thales proposed that water was the original material from which all other material was derived, and by that he was referring not only to things on earth, but also in the heavens. He observed that life sprouts from a moist ground, unlike death that dries and shrivels into dust. The fact that water could transform itself into a solid, as it does when it freezes into ice, or it could change into air, as it does when heated into steam, well, this convinced him that everything had originated as water and would eventually return to water. He believed that all things are living things, including rocks and metals And so literally everything would transform itself into the original material, water, in a logical pattern of change. A little later, Anaximander, and he was a student of Thales, so Anaximander was set on a path that involved questioning which of the elements was the most basic or fundamental. But he suggested that the universe was not originally made up of water, as Thales had reasoned, but was a living mass, which he called the infinite. The word in Greek actually means unlimited, but most translators have used the term infinite since it probably captures the meaning a little better in English. So, Anaximander put forward what some believe is the first theoretical postulate, that the infinite was constantly in motion, up and down, back and forth. So, although the infinite had begun as a whole, the motion had caused pieces to be broken off to form all of the elements of the universe, the earth, the sun, stars. Then, he speculated that as the oceans had begun to evaporate, the first sea plants and animals had formed, and from them, their descendants, the birds and land animals, evolved, until finally mankind was created.
That sounds a lot like evolutionary theory.
Yes, it does. Probably the first instance of evolutionary theory among Europeans, although the Chinese philosophers had discussed this possibility earlier. Okay, so what do you think he postulated about the continued motion of the universe? Anyone?
I remember that part. He thought that all of these separate elements would eventually be put back together into the original infinite mass.
Precisely right. But good students think for themselves, and some years later, Anaximander's student, Anaximenes, criticized his teacher's view. He deduced that the original element of the universe was air, which was timeless and boundless, and in fact, alive. Because mankind and all the animals must breathe air in order to survive, he believed, therefore, that air had been transformed into blood, bone, and flesh. He also concluded that air was the origin of water, stone, and earth, and I think you can see the analogy with the parts of the body there. Furthermore, he contended that the solid condensations of air constituted the body of the world, but the ethereal quality of air constituted the spirit of the world, and it was the spirit that remained alive forever. Now, these three philosophers, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, they were all residents of Miletus, and were very active beginning about 600 years before the Christian era. So, they were called the Milesian philosophers, and they all had different views, but they also had something in common.
Do you mean that they were all materialists? Because they were trying to explain the universe in terms of perceivable elements like water and air?
Good observation. Let's take that a step further. They all attempted to explain the unknown in terms of the familiar, instead of looking to the current mythologies or to a divine presence. And that's what is truly extraordinary about these pre-Socratic philosophers. A naturalistic account of the cosmos was profoundly different from the myths and legends of gods and goddesses that had been the basis for explaining the origin of the universe.
So what do you mean by naturalistic?
I mean that they tried to use scientific arguments, and this marked a very new way of thinking. Unlike the exciting narratives of superhuman beings with the powers to create and change the universe, they proposed that the universe was made up of something very basic, and that it was constantly undergoing natural changes. The Milesians made a major contribution, and they did this by moving beyond the old mythologies and folk tales, and some scholars even suggest that they were responsible for the beginnings of Western philosophy as we know it. Now, when we talk about philosophy, it's important to point out that for many centuries, philosophy was not a separate discipline from other areas of thought and knowledge. In fact, early philosophers were mathematicians, physicists, chemists, and biologists before any of these sciences were identified as separate subjects or fields of study. So the pre-Socratic philosophers were trying to discover a scientific basis for the universe long before the scientific method and the technologies were available to support their investigations. But really, many scholars argue that these philosophers did initiate the process, at least, and the process eventually resulted, years later, as the beginning of the physical sciences. Okay, all of this appears on the surface to be very positive, right? But at the time, many philosophers, as well as ordinary citizens, were feeling much less comfortable with the very sparse tenets of emerging science than they had been with the rich and complicated stories that had explained the universe for them. Remember that this is all before Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato, who were, by then, more able to expand on proto-scientific thought and produce a massive and elaborate scientific alternative to the ancient beliefs.
12. What is the discussion mainly about? (13) Why does the student mention evolutionary theory? 14. Listen again to part of the discussion and then answer the following question.
Do you mean that they were all materialists? Because they were trying to explain the universe in terms of perceivable elements like water and air?
Good observation. Let's take that a step further.
Why does the professor say this?
Good observation. Let's take that a step further.
15. What view did the three Milesian philosophers share? (16) What can be inferred about the early Greek philosophers? (17) Listen again to part of the discussion and then answer the following question.
Okay, all of this appears on the surface to be very positive, right? But at the time, many philosophers, as well as ordinary citizens, were feeling much less comfortable with the very sparse tenets of emerging science than they had been with the rich and complicated stories that had explained the universe for them.
What does the professor mean when she says this?
Okay, all of this appears on the surface to be very positive, right?
Listening 4. Professor's Office.
Now listen to a conversation between a student and a professor.
Excuse me, Professor Jones. I was wondering whether I could talk with you for a minute. If you're busy now, though.
Sure, Ann. What's up?
Well, I've been working on my research project. I'm doing it on decaffeinated beverages.
Oh, I remember. That's going to be interesting. How's it going?
Good. I've got all the data, but the report's turning out to be fairly short. It took such a long time to do the research, I thought I'd have a lot more to write about.
Well, how long will it be, do you think?
Probably 5 or 6 pages, and that includes a couple of pages with charts in them.
That sounds about right.
It does?
Yes. Oh, of course, it depends on what you included in the 5 pages. The issue here is whether the research design was well thought out and whether you have all the information in your report that you need to explain what you did, the approach, and the results that you found.
Okay. I have a short introduction, just a few paragraphs, really. So that's about caffeine. And then I talk about the benefits of decaffeination and several ways to do that.
Uh-huh. What else?
Well, I explained my research design, and that's sort of a problem too, because I'm not sure whether to make this sound like a book. You know, the way the studies are explained in our textbook, or whether I should just write it up as clearly as I can so that anyone would understand what I did.
I'd go for that option. In fact, why don't you ask a few friends to read it before you turn it in? If your friends get it, that's a good indication that you've explained it well. But if they have a lot of questions, then maybe you need to do some rewriting. And Anne, it's even better if your friends aren't chemistry majors like you are.
Well, I would never have thought of that.
Then I'm glad I suggested it. By the way, did you include references at the end of your study?
Just 2. That's all I used.
Okay, good. Just as long as you cite the references you used.
Well, thanks. This is the first time I've ever done my own research. It was hard because I didn't have any experience, but it was fun, too. I was thinking about trying to get a part-time job as a lab assistant next year.
I think you'd be a good candidate. In fact, why don't you write up a draft of that report and I'll look it over for you before you hand in the final copy.
That would be perfect. I could bring it in on Monday, since that's when you have your usual office hours. Would that be okay?
Yes, but that'd only give you 1 day before the report's due.
Oh, right.
Okay, then, why don't you bring it to class on Friday?
It'd be great.
And Anne, if you're really serious about that lab assistant position, I can give you some information about that when I see you.
Oh, I can't thank you enough.
Not at all, Anne. You've got a lot going for you. I'm glad to help.
18. Why does the woman want to talk with her professor? (19) What advice does the professor give the woman? (20) What does the professor offer to do? (21) Listen again to part of the conversation, and then answer the following question.
I could bring it in on Monday, since that's when you have your usual office hours. Would that be okay?
Yes, but that'd only give you 1 day before the report's due.
Oh, right.
Why does the professor say this?
Yes, but that'd only give you 1 day before the report's due.
(22) What is the professor's opinion of the woman?
Listening 5. Biology class.
Listen to part of a lecture in a biology class. The professor is talking about bacteria.
Bacteria is the common name for a very large group of one-celled microscopic organisms that we believe may be the smallest, simplest, and perhaps even the very first forms of cellular life that evolved on Earth. Because they're so small, bacteria must be measured in microns, with 1 micron measuring about 0.00004 inches long. Most bacteria range from about 0.1 microns to about 4 microns wide and about 0.2 microns to almost 50 microns long. So, how can we observe them? I'll give you one guess. Under the microscope, of course. As I said, bacteria are very primitive and simple. In fact, they're unicellular, which means that they're made up of a single cell. We think they probably evolved about 3.5 billion years ago. Some of the oldest fossils are bacterial organisms. They've been found almost everywhere on Earth, including all the continents, seas, and freshwater habitats, and in the tissues of both plants and animals. Well, since they're so prevalent, you might ask, how do they reproduce? Okay, they grow in colonies and can reproduce quite rapidly, in fact, by a process called fission. In fission, the cell, and remember, there's only one in bacteria, one cell. So the cell increases in size and then splits in 2 parts. Fission's also referred to in your text as asexual budding. Now, you'll also read about conjugation, and that's when two separate bacteria exchange pieces of DNA. So there are two ways that reproduction can occur, but we think that fission's more common. Okay, bacteria were virtually unknown until about 1600, when microscopes were introduced. And at that time, bacteria were observed and classified into three main types according to their shapes. And that classification hasn't really changed that much over the years. So that's what I want to talk about today, the main types of bacteria. The slides that I'm going to show you are enlargements of bacteria that I observed under the microscope in the lab earlier today. Now, this first slide is an example of bacilli. The bacilli are a group of bacteria that occur in the soil and air. As you can see, they're shaped like rods. And if you were to see them in motion, they'd be rolling or tumbling under the microscope. Of course, you can't see that because this is a still visual. But later, when you go into the lab, you'll see that rolling motion in examples of bacilli. These are kind of a greenish blue, but some are yellow. So don't try to identify them by their color. Look at the shape. These bacilli are largely responsible for food spoilage. Okay, the next slide's a very different shape of bacteria. It's referred to as the cocci group, and it tends to grow in clusters or chains, like this example. This specimen's one of the common streptococci bacteria that cause strep throat. Finally, let's look at the spiral-shaped bacteria called the spirilla. This is the spirilla. They look a little like corkscrews, and they're responsible for a number of diseases in humans. But I don't want you to get the wrong idea. It's true that some species of bacteria do cause diseases, but for the most part, bacteria are benign. There's a lot of bacteria in this room, in fact. We all have it on us. They live harmlessly on the skin, in the mouth, and in the intestines. In fact, bacteria are very helpful to researchers because bacterial cells resemble the cells of other life forms in many ways and may be studied to give us insights. For example, we have a major research project in genetics here at the university. Since bacteria reproduce very rapidly, we're using them to determine how certain characteristics are inherited. Okay, now, let me review these three types with you. Cocci are spheres, bacilli are rods, and spirillae are spirals. One of my students came up with a way to remember them. Just try to visualize the first letter in the name of each of the different types. Cocci starts with C, like the shape of half a sphere. Bacilli starts with a straight line on the B, and a rod is straight. Spirilla starts with an S, and that's a spiral shape. If it helps you, use it. In any case, although I want you to know the three major classifications, within these basic groups there are virtually hundreds of variations that make them somewhat more difficult to identify and classify than the rather straightforward specimens that I showed you a minute ago. Because you see, bacteria can join in chains, clusters, pairs, and sometimes more than one type of bacteria may be found together in a specimen. I think you get the picture. Okay then, in addition to identifying bacteria by their shape, which we now know isn't really a very good method for distinguishing them easily, if we really want to identify what type of bacteria we're dealing with, it's better to study the biochemistry or genetic structure of the specimen. They have one chromosome of double-stranded DNA in a ring, which we can analyze fairly easily.
23. What aspect of bacteria is this lecture mainly about? (24) Which of the following slides contain cocci bacteria? (25) Which two characteristics are common in bacteria? (26) Why are bacteria being used in the research study at the university? (27) How does the professor help the students to remember the types of bacteria? (28) Listen again to part of the lecture and then answer the following question.
Because you see, bacteria can join in chains, clusters, pairs, and sometimes more than one type of bacteria may be found together in a specimen. I think you get the picture.
Why does the professor say this?
I think you get the picture.
Listening 6. History class.
Listen to part of a lecture in a history class.
Frontier home design in the United States was greatly influenced by the provisions of the Homestead Act of 1862. The legislation gave settlers the right to open land, but mandated that homesteaders build a structure that was at least 10 by 12 feet and included at least one glass window. And they had to live on their homestead and improve the land for 5 years before their claim was recognized. Of course, when they first arrived, most homesteaders lived in their wagons or pitched tents until they filed claims and planted crops. And even then, knowing that fully half of the homesteaders wouldn't make it through the 5 years required to complete their claims, homesteaders tended to view the construction of their homes as semi-permanent dwellings. More likely, they'd build something better later or try to improve on what they'd built initially if they made it through the first 5 years. So, in addition to the requirements in the Homestead Act, the settlers needed a home that was easy to build, cheap, and maybe even disposable. Well, the log cabin's the construction that comes to mind when we think of Western settlements. But the plains and the prairies had so few trees that log construction was almost impossible. So the sod house was a practical solution for homesteaders on flat, treeless land. So how do you build a sod house? Well, first you wait for a rain that makes the earth soft. Then you use a sod cutter to form sod bricks about 2 or 3 feet square and a few inches thick. Then you stack the bricks to form walls and weave branches or twigs and grass into a roof that's finally covered with sod as well. Now, there were tremendous advantages to this type of construction. In the first place, it was very cheap. There are journals from the 1800s that document construction prices at about $2.50, and most of that was for the glass window. And it took very little time to build, probably a day or two, and the thick walls actually kept the house quite cool in the summer and fairly warm in the winter. If a better home could be built later, the sod house would simply dissolve into the soil. But there were serious disadvantages as well. Even well-built roofs leaked onto the dirt floors, forming mud puddles, and sometimes the roof even collapsed from the water weight. Or in dry spells, the dirt crumbled from the roof into the home, not to mention the infestations of insects and even snakes that inhabited the dirt walls. So those settlers who arrived in wooded areas opted to build log cabins instead of sod homes. Like the sod construction, the log cabin could be built in a few days using simple tools, often only an axe. But it was much more comfortable. There's evidence that the first log cabins were introduced by Swedish settlers as early as the 1700s, but other immigrant settlers quickly adopted the construction. First, you build a foundation of rocks to keep the logs away from dampness that might cause them to rot. Then you cut down the trees and square off the logs, cutting notches in the top and bottom of each end so they could fit together when they were stacked at the corners. And it also had the advantage of assuring structural integrity. And there were several types of notching techniques that were used, depending on the skill of the builder. In any case, with notching, no nails were required. And that was good, since nails had to be shipped into towns and then transported out to the new settlements. But there were gaps in the walls, so these had to be filled by a technique called chinking. In chinking, grass, hay, moss, and mud were worked into rolls about a foot long and maybe 4 inches wide, and then they were inserted into the cracks between the logs. These rolls were commonly referred to as mudcats and were very effective in keeping out the cold and keeping in the heat. Of course, the tighter the logs, the fewer chinks were required, and that's important because the chinks were the weakest part of the cabin. And with the expansion and contraction that resulted from freezing and thawing, well, chinking tended to deteriorate and needed constant maintenance and repair. Okay, there was usually a stone or brick fireplace along one wall, and the roof was usually made of wood shingles. So you can imagine this was quite an improvement over the sod house. The advantages were that the home could be kept clean. Even though the floor was usually dirt or gravel because flat boards were difficult to obtain, it was still an effective shelter to keep out the rain and dust. Later, at the end of the 1800s, when the railroads brought materials such as asphalt shingles, tar paper, and finished boards to the frontier, the sod house was abandoned for one-room board shanties covered with tar paper. Whether this was an improvement is subject to debate. For one thing, since they were often built without foundations, the harsh winds of the prairies literally blew the shanties away. Still, many settlers considered the shacks preferable to the old soddies, even though they weren't as easy to heat and cool. To go back to the log cabin for a minute, the effect of new construction materials on the log cabin was aesthetic, as well as practical. The logs were often covered on the outside by finished boards and on the inside with plaster, which gave the cabins a more finished look and improved insulation. And by this time, the old one-room 10 by 12 was also being replaced with larger homes with several rooms. The frontier settlers had weathered the hardships of their first 5 years. They'd received their claims, and they and their homes were a permanent part of the great Western expansion.
29. What is the lecture mainly about? 30. How does the professor organize his lecture? 31. What does the professor imply about construction materials for early homes? 32. What is the evidence for the inexpensive price of a sod home? 33. Listen again to part of the lecture and then answer the following question.
Later, at the end of the 1800s, when the railroads brought materials such as asphalt shingles, tar paper, and finished boards to the frontier, the sod house was abandoned for one-room board shanties covered with tar paper. Whether this was an improvement is subject to debate.
Why does the professor say this?
Whether this was an improvement is subject to debate.
34. In the lecture, the professor identifies attributes for different frontier homes. Indicate whether each attribute refers to a sod house or a log cabin. Click in the correct box for each phrase. Model Test 3. Speaking Section. The speaking section tests your ability to communicate in English in an academic setting. During the test, you will be presented with 6 speaking questions. The questions ask for a response to a single question, a conversation, a talk, or a lecture. You may take notes as you listen, but notes are not graded. You may use your notes to answer the questions. Some of the questions ask for a response to a reading passage and a talk or a lecture. The reading passages and the questions are written, but most of the directions will be spoken. Your speaking will be evaluated on both the fluency of the language and the accuracy of the content. You will have 15 to 20 seconds to prepare and 45 to 60 seconds to respond to each question. Typically, a good response will require all of the response time, but the answer will be complete by the end of the response time. The time for the speaking section is about 20 minutes. A clock on the screen will show you how much time you have to prepare your answer and how much time you have to record it.
Number 1. Listen for a question about a familiar topic. After you hear the question, you have 15 seconds to prepare and 45 seconds to record your answer.
In your opinion, what are the characteristics of a good son or daughter in a family? Use specific examples and details to explain your answer.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Number 2. Listen for a question that asks your opinion about a familiar topic. After you hear the question, you have 15 seconds to prepare and 45 seconds to record your answer.
Some people are attracted to jobs that include a great deal of travel. Other people prefer jobs that allow them to return to their homes every evening. Which type of job opportunity would you prefer, and why? Use specific reasons and examples to support your opinion.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Number 3. Read a short passage and listen to a talk on the same topic. Then listen for a question about them. After you hear the question, you have 30 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to record your answer.
The professor's attendance policy is published in the course syllabus. Read the policy in the course syllabus printed on page 372. You have 45 seconds to complete it. Please begin reading now. Now listen to a student who is talking with friends about the policy.
On the one hand, it's good that you can be absent once without explaining why. But on the other hand, you can't be absent more than one time without getting a lower grade. So I'd rather have the option of explaining my problem to the professor if I need to be absent, and then try to figure out a way to make up the work. Look, if I'm sick for 2 weeks, I don't think it's fair for the professor to lower my grade as long as I keep up with the class. Or if you have a legitimate reason not to be there, like a family emergency or something, I don't think you should have to choose between your health or your family and your grade in the class.
The student expresses his opinion of the professor's policy for excused absences. Report his opinion and explain the reasons that he gives for having that opinion.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Number 4. Read a short passage and then listen to part of a lecture on the same topic. Then listen for a question about them. After you hear the question, you have 30 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to record your answer.
Now read the passage about insects, printed on page 373. You have 45 seconds to complete it. Please begin reading now. Now listen to part of a lecture in a biology class. The professor is talking about insects.
Strictly speaking, a spider is not an insect. True, it's an invertebrate and an arthropod, but it belongs to a class identified as arachnids. Arachnids are not included in the insect world because their bodies' structures very different. The bodies of spiders are divided into two parts. The head with a fused thorax, which is all one structure, and the second part is a separate abdomen joined to the large head-thorax part by a narrow stalk. The head contains what many researchers now believe is a highly developed brain. There are no antennae, but 4 pairs of eyes and 8 legs covered with fine, sensitive hairs more than compensate for the absence of the antennae. These hairy legs and feet explore the environment, sending sensory messages back to the brain. Okay, the abdomen. Remember, that's the second part of the spider. It includes not only the digestive and reproductive systems, but also the silk glands that allow spiders to spin their webs. So, as you see, even though spiders and insects are commonly grouped together as bugs, they're really not the same. An oversimplification is that spiders have too many legs and not enough wings. In reality, the entire body's structure is quite different.
Describe the structure of an insect and explain why a spider is not strictly considered an insect.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Number 5. Listen to a short conversation. Then listen for a question about it. After you hear the question, you have 20 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to record your answer.
Now listen to a conversation between a student and his friend.
Can you believe that I've been here almost a whole semester and you're the only friend I've made?
No. How can that be?
I don't know. You know me better than anyone here at school. I thought maybe you could give me some advice.
Sure. Well, do you belong to any clubs or any organizations on campus? That's always a good way to meet people.
No, I don't have a lot of time to, go to meetings.
Well, neither do I, but I do play intramural sports.
What's that?
It's just a group that meets regularly to play basketball. Of course, there are lots of other teams besides basketball, You could join a football team or soccer, baseball, volleyball. Just go over to the recreation center and sign up. They'll put you on a team. You could use some time away from the books.
I'd like to do that, but...
Well, since you don't want to take time away from your studies, why don't you join a study group or get one going in one of your classes? That way you wouldn't feel like you're wasting time. And besides, the people you meet will be serious students, so maybe they'd be better friends for you anyway.
Describe the man's problem and the 2 suggestions that his friend makes about how to handle it. What do you think the man should do, and why?
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Number 6. Listen to part of a lecture. Then listen for a question about it. After you hear the question, you have 20 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to record your answer.
Now listen to part of a lecture in a psychology class. The professor is discussing the Skinner box.
There have been several references to the Skinner box in your textbook because a lot of behavioral modification experiments still use similar devices even today. So let's just take a few minutes and make sure that everyone understands exactly what a Skinner box is and how it works. The box, which was named for B.F. Skinner, the American psychologist who developed it, it was used in Skinner's original experiment in 1932. And its construction hasn't changed much from that time. It's just a small, empty box, really, except for a bar with a cup underneath it. So picture this. In Skinner's experiment, a rat that had been deprived of food for 24 hours was placed in the box. As the animal began to explore its new environment, it accidentally hit the bar, and a food pellet dropped into the cup. The rat ate the pellet and continued exploring for more food. After hitting the bar 3 or 4 times with similar results, the animal started hitting the bar with intention instead of by accident. It had learned that it could get food by pressing the bar. In other words, the food stimulus reinforced the bar-pressing response. So, many psychology experiments were modeled after Skinner's original research. Various animals have been placed in modified Skinner boxes and presented with conditions that will result in a reward, food or some other desirable object or experience. In most of the behavior modification experiments in your book, you'll see a citation for Skinner's classic study.
Using the main points and examples from the lecture, describe the Skinner box, and then explain how the device is used in psychology experiments.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Model Test 3, Writing Section.
First, read the passage on page 378 and take notes. Now listen to a lecture on the same topic as the passage that you have just read.
Most textbooks that have been published within the past 50 years include the Miller-Urey experiment because it was such a groundbreaking discovery at the time, and researchers honestly believed that they were on the verge of discovering the origin of life. But the current view of the Miller-Urey experiment is, let's say, skeptical. And there are several serious objections that we really need to deal with before we move on. First, the laboratory atmosphere that Miller and Urey created was charged with continuous electrical energy, but even though the atmosphere of early Earth was subjected to frequent electrical storms, they were probably not continuous. So, some scientists argue that although amino acids and other organic compounds may have been formed in the early history of Earth, they probably would not have been produced in the amounts seen in the experimental environment. Some scientists are also concerned about the fact that oxygen was reduced from the atmosphere in the Miller-Urey experiment. What if the premise that the mixture of gases simulated that of early Earth were false? Then, of course, everything else in the experiment is flawed. And here's another problem. Because several meteorites have fallen to Earth since the publication of the Miller-Urey experiment, there has been interest in analyzing them for amino acid content, and amino acids have been found in them. Well, that proves that amino acids are able to survive in severe conditions in space. So what does that mean? Some scientists think that the early Earth was similar to asteroids and comets that contain amino acids, so they may have been present from the moment that the Earth was formed. Others point to the possibility that organic compounds escaped from within meteorites in impact sites where they hit the surface of the newly forming planet Earth. The truth is that we just don't know how the first cell was formed, and we really aren't sure how that cell reorganized into larger living structures. So, although the Miller-Urey experiment is interesting, it probably does not hold the promise of unlocking the mystery of life on our planet.
Model Test 3. Example answers.
Example answer for independent speaking question 1. A good son or daughter.
The role of a good son or daughter changes over the years. Initially, being an obedient child's probably all that a parent requires. But when a child grows up and begins to become independent, then a good son or daughter is a person who has good character, who does well in school or succeeds in a career and demonstrates the personal qualities that the parents have tried to teach. A good son or daughter is also a good parent when they have children of their own. When parents see their grandchildren being brought up well, they know that they've provided a good example. And when the parents become old and need care, a good son or daughter won't be too busy to spend time with them and provide them with help.
Example answer for independent speaking question 2. Job opportunities.
Although a job that involves travel seems glamorous to people who spend day after day in an office, it really isn't for me. For one thing, traveling for business usually means going to the same places repeatedly and staying in the same tired hotel rooms. Besides that, the pace of a business trip doesn't allow much time to see anything besides the inside of an office building and the road to the airport. And eating in restaurants isn't that healthy, and traveling all the time is exhausting. No, I'd rather have a job opportunity that would let me sleep in my own bed and eat my own cooking. But ideally, the job would also include a 3-week paid vacation, so I could travel to a destination of my choice and relax.
Example answer for integrated speaking question 3. Excused absence.
According to the professor's policy, students can be absent from one class without explaining unless there's a test scheduled. And then the professor expects students to go to her office to give her an explanation for being out of class and arrange for making up the test. Also, being absent more than once could mean that your grade could be lowered by 1 letter for each time you miss class. The student doesn't agree with the excused absence policy because he thinks that his grade shouldn't be affected by absence if he makes up the work. From his point of view, a valid reason for absence, like an emergency, a family problem, or illness, that shouldn't jeopardize his grade unless he fails to keep up with the class or his work's unsatisfactory.
Example answer for integrated speaking question 4. Insects.
Insects are arthropods with a 3-part body structure: a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. The head has a pair of eyes and a pair of antennae, and 3 pairs of legs and 2 pairs of wings are usually attached to the thorax. Now, although a spider is also an arthropod, it isn't considered an insect, because it only has a 2-part body structure. The head and the thorax are joined together on a spider and attached to its abdomen by a thin stem. And a spider doesn't have antennae, but it does have 4 pairs of eyes. Instead of 6 legs, it has 8 hairy legs that are used kind of like an insect uses its antennae to explore the environment. A spider doesn't have wings. It has a unique glandular system that allows it to spin its webs. So, because of this very different body structure, a spider's not really an insect.
Example answer for integrated speaking question 5. Meeting people.
The man's problem is that he hasn't been very successful meeting people and making friends. He's been on campus for an entire semester, and the woman's the only friend he has. She suggests that he participate in some clubs, but he's reluctant to spend the time required for meetings. The woman plays intramural basketball. She says that there are a lot of sports options at the recreation center. Another possibility that she recommends is for the man to join a study group. That way, he'd meet some serious students, and he'd still be using the time to study for classes while he was getting to know people. I think that the man should join a group to play sports for an hour, twice a week, because he probably needs the exercise, and he should also try to get into a study group, because he'll probably have more in common with the people who are using their time to study for their classes.
Example answer for integrated speaking question 6. Skinner box.
A Skinner box is a small box that's empty except for a cup and a bar. When the bar over the cup's depressed, a food pellet drops into the cup. An animal that's placed in a Skinner box will explore the environment for food and at some point will accidentally hit the bar, releasing the pellet. So, after the animal hits the bar about 3 or 4 times and it's rewarded with food, then it learns how to find food using the bar, and it begins to hit the bar on purpose. The Skinner box, or something like it, it's commonly used in psychology experiments that involve behavior modification. By presenting a subject with the opportunity for a reward, the behavior that produces the reward is reinforced. In the case of the classic experiment, the subject's opportunity for a reward is a food pellet, and the behavior that's reinforced is pressing the bar. But many types of rewards and behaviors have been used.
This is the end of the audio for Barron's Passkey to the TOEFL iBT 6th edition. Now listen to a message from the author, Dr. Pamela Sharp.
Hello. Throughout this book, you have studied the keys for success on the TOEFL iBT. I hope that you will also develop and maintain a positive attitude while you prepare for this important test. Here is the affirmation that I asked you to repeat at the beginning of this book. Now, repeat it with me. I know more today than I did yesterday. I am preparing. I will succeed. Best wishes on the TOEFL and after the TOEFL. Goodbye for now.